On this day in history, June 28, 1491, a prince was born whose personal obsession would tear a country from its religious foundations, challenge the most powerful man in the world, and change the course of a nation forever. This isn't just the story of a king with 6 wives, it's the story of how one man's desperate quest for a male heir unleashed a revolution that nobody saw coming. How did the private desires of Henry VIII become a public spectacle of betrayal, execution, and the birth of a new church? Before the tyrant, there was the Golden Prince. When a young Henry VIII took the throne, he was everything his people could want. Handsome, athletic, a scholar and a musician, he was the picture of a new era. England was a devoutly Catholic nation, and Henry himself was so religious that the Pope had even granted him the title of Defender of the Faith. He inherited a stable kingdom from his father, Henry VII, who had ended the bloody Wars of the Roses. But that stability all depended on one fragile thing: producing a male heir. The memory of civil war was still fresh. A king without a son meant a future of chaos, and that was a risk no one wanted to take. To secure the dynasty, Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess with impeccable royal blood. For years they tried to do their duty. Catherine endured multiple pregnancies, but one after another they ended in heartbreak. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and babies who died within weeks. Only one child survived to grow up, a daughter, Mary. In the 16th century, a queen ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. A daughter wasn't the heir Henry needed to secure the Tudor line. As the years ticked by, the king's anxiety began to curdle into a dangerous obsession. He became convinced his marriage was cursed by God, a punishment for marrying his brother's wife, something forbidden in the Bible, and as that dark thought took root, his eyes began to wander. They wandered to a woman named Anne Boleyn. She wasn't like the other ladies at court. Witty, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious after years in the sophisticated courts of Europe, she made it clear she would not be the king's mistress, a role her own sister had played. She would be his queen or she would be nothing. Her refusal just made Henry want her more. Anne became the living, breathing symbol of everything he craved: a fresh start, a new queen, and above all, the promise of a son. This kicked off what became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry had to end his 24-year marriage to Catherine, but in the Catholic world, divorce was off the table. What he needed was an annulment, a declaration from the Pope that the marriage had never been valid. Confident his loyalty as defender of the faith would be rewarded, he sent his advisors to Rome, but the answer was no. Pope Clement VII was caught between a rock and a hard place. He was essentially a prisoner of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. To grant the annulment would be to defy the emperor and admit that a previous pope had made a mistake. For any other monarch, that would have been the end of it. But not for Henry. If the church wouldn't give him what he wanted, he would just get rid of the church. This was the point of no return. Guided by clever, ambitious advisors like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, Henry started down a path that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. he began to systematically dismantle papal authority in England. A series of laws passed by a cooperative parliament declared that the king, not the pope, was the supreme head of the church in England. This wasn't just politics, it was a theological earthquake. The Church of England was born not from a popular movement but from the iron will of one man. In 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, finally gave Henry the annulment he craved. Days later, he validated Henry's secret marriage to Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant. The king had his new queen. He had defied the most powerful institution on earth. All he needed now was a son. But when Anne gave birth, it wasn't the boy he'd gambled everything on, it was another daughter, Elizabeth. The king's disappointment was shattering. The break with Rome, the defiance of the Pope, alienating his allies, all for another girl. Anne Boleyn's failure to produce a son was the beginning of her end. Paranoid and desperate, Henry quickly grew tired of her fiery spirit. When she miscarried a son, her fate was sealed. Trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason were brought against her. In May 1536, less than 3 years after being crowned, Queen Anne Boleyn was executed on the Tower Green. The charming prince was long gone, replaced by a ruthless tyrant who would crush anyone who stood in his path. His quest for an heir marched on with a chilling rhythm. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour. She finally gave him what he had obsessed over for decades, a son, Edward. But the celebration was cut short. Jane died from complications of childbirth just 12 days later. Though he finally had his heir, Henry was heartbroken. He considered Jane his only true wife and commanded that he be buried beside her. But the kingdom still needed securing. What followed was a string of marriages. His union with German Princess Anne of Cleves was a political mismatch and a personal disaster. Henry found her so unappealing that the marriage was annulled in months. Wife number 5, the young and lively Catherine Howard, brought a brief flash of joy to the aging king. But her past and present affairs soon came to light. She met the same fate as her cousin, Anne Boleyn, on the executioner's block. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was a mature widow who served more as a nurse and companion to the increasingly obese and ailing king. She managed what so many others couldn't. She outlived him. Alongside this marital drama, Henry and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell unleashed a radical transformation of England. To assert his new authority and fill his empty treasury, Henry ordered the dissolution of the monasteries. For centuries, these institutions had been centers of wealth, learning, and charity. Now they were systematically torn down, their lands and riches seized by the crown. This act reshaped English society but also sparked furious backlash, most famously the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive northern uprising that Henry crushed with brutal force. The story of Henry VIII is a stark reminder of how the personal obsessions of one person can echo through history. If you find these incredible lives as fascinating as we do, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next trip into the past. And let us know in the comments which historical figure you want us to explore next. Henry VIII died in 1547, a bloated, paranoid wreck of the vibrant prince he had once been. He left behind a kingdom that was religiously fractured, financially shaky, and facing an uncertain future. His reign often seems like a whirlwind of ego and lust, but the changes he forced upon England were profound and permanent. His greatest legacy, without a doubt, is the Church of England. The break with Rome set the nation on a unique religious course that, despite centuries of conflict, forged a distinct English identity. By seizing church lands, he created a new class of wealthy landowners whose loyalty was now tied directly to the crown and the new religious order. And what about his children? The very reason for all the turmoil. His long-awaited son, Edward VI, ruled for only 6 years before his death. He was followed by his fiercely Catholic sister, Mary I, whose brutal efforts to reverse the Reformation earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. But in the end it was his other daughter, the one from the scandalous marriage to Anne Boleyn, who would define the Tudor legacy. Elizabeth I, the daughter he never wanted, would rule for over 40 years, becoming one of England's greatest monarchs. She solidified the Protestant Church, defeated the Spanish Armada, and ushered in a golden age. Ultimately, the king who tore his country apart for a male heir left his kingdom to be brilliantly ruled by his daughters. Henry VIII was born on this day, a man whose personal fears and desires were so immense they shattered a centuries-old faith and forged a new future for a nation, a future he could never have possibly imagined.